Welcome to our annual Fall Implementation Science Seminar series. My name is Dr. Alethea DeRogers, and I am an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Human Behavior at Brown University, and also a core faculty member of our Bridge Research on Implementation and Dissemination to Guide Evidence Use, or BRIDGE program. This is the 7th year of our implementation science programming, and we are thrilled to be able to bring these seminars to our Providence and Rhode Island community of implementation scientists, as well as those of you who are joining us from other states or parts of the world even. We are grateful for the partnership of the Advanced Rhode Island Clinical and Translational Research, or RI-CTR, for supporting the technology, logistics, and marketing of these seminars. We also recognize our partnership with the Brown Alcohol Research Center on HIV for their support. Now, without further delay, I'm very excited to introduce today's seminar speaker. Dr. Ariana Albanese is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Human Behavior at Brown University and a member of our BRIDGE program. She also completed her postdoctoral fellowship at the Warren Alpert Medical School of Brown University. Her program of research is focused on improving behavioral health outcomes with a particular focus on behavioral health during pregnancy and postpartum. As an implementation science methodologist, her research has covered various content and methodological areas such as community engagement, formative evaluation, assessment of implementation outcomes, and qualitative and mixed methods, including rapid qualitative methods for use in implementation science, which happens to be the topic that she'll speak about today. The title of her presentation is A Rapid Approach to Qualitative Analysis. And I will turn the floor over to her right now. Thank you so much, Dr. Albanese. And just as a reminder, you can put your questions in the chat throughout the seminar, and we'll save time for a discussion and Q&A at the end. Over to you.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Alethea. All right. So I am excited to talk to you all today about a rapid approach to qualitative analysis. And as a little teaser for the Harry Potter fans in the crowd, we will have some Harry Potter content coming up. So look lively for that. Okay, so Alethea teed this up really nicely, but why am I talking to you about qualitative methods in an implementation science seminar? So for those of you who are more familiar with implementation science, you will know that qualitative methods are frequently used in implementation science, and for good reason. But for those who may be less familiar, I do want to spend a few minutes talking to you about kind of the value of qualitative methods in implementation science. And there are kind of two overarching points related to that, which are that qualitative methods are valuable to implementation science because they provide such deep insights into things like processes, context, experiences, and we know that those things are so important when we're looking at key implementation outcomes or constructs like adoption, adaptation, and sustainability of interventions in real-world settings. So qualitative methods helps us go from what works to answer how does it work, why does it work, or how is something adopted, why is something adopted, how and why is something adapted, how and why is something sustainable in our particular setting. And having a deeper understanding of these factors that contribute to successful context-sensitive implementation is incredibly valuable. So having said those overarching points, I want to drill down a bit more deeply into the ways that qualitative methods support our work in implementation science. So I've listed a slew of them on this slide here, and I'm going to go through each one by one and just provide a bit more content about what I mean. So qualitative methods allows us to understand context. So implementation science often deals with complex, dynamic environments like healthcare settings, community organizations, and qualitative methods like interviews and focus groups can help researchers understand the specific contextual factors, whether they're cultural, organizational, political, social, that are affecting the success or failure of their implementation effort, of their intervention or their practice. Qualitative methods also, and I think this is the one that maybe I might argue comes up most frequently. Qualitative methods in implementation science allows us to explore barriers and facilitators to implementation. Qualitative research can uncover the barriers and facilitators that are impacting implementation. And these can include, a number of things that many folks might already be familiar with, like the attitudes of key informants, resource limitations, policy constraints, or other situational factors that quantitative methods might not fully capture. But it is really important for us to know as we're developing strategies to implement or are supporting an implementation effort. We need to know those things. Qualitative methods also allows us to capture key informant perspectives. So the perspectives of individuals involved with or impacted by implementation, like patients, providers, policymakers, administrators, etc., those perspectives are really crucial. And qualitative methods allows researchers to explore these perspectives in depth, providing insight into things like motivations, concerns, experiences, which are really often pivotal for successful implementation. And it really allows us to capture that effectively, that information, and use it in our implementation effort. Qualitative methods also can play a really critical role in adapting our evidence-based practices for our contexts. And so, again, many folks may already be well acquainted with this fact, but interventions or evidence-based practices often need to be adapted to fit different contexts. And qualitative methods help identify which aspects of an intervention are critical and which can be modified without losing effectiveness. Not that this is the only way to do this. There are other quantitative ways to do that as well. But qualitative methods can certainly play a valuable role in that sort of assessment. And this flexibility, kind of figuring out those core components is key for scaling and sustaining interventions across diverse settings, figuring out what is that kind of adaptable periphery that we can have some latitude, some leeway to adapt to our context so that it can fit better and really take root. The EBP can take root in this context. And these methods can also allow us to collect data to help us to know what we can be doing to better adapt our EBP or our intervention to fix the context at hand. So it can help us better understand what's not working. Why is it not working? Where's the mismatch? It can give us really valuable data about that. Qualitative methods can also help us identify mechanisms of change so understanding mechanisms of change through which an intervention works or doesn't work, for example, understanding how change happens rather than just whether it happens, can inform better implementation strategies and often lead to more effective implementation interventions or efforts. Qualitative methods also contribute to the development of theories and frameworks that guide implementation science. So anyone, who has even, I think, kind of like a glancing familiarity with implementation science will know that theories, models, and frameworks, really lead the work and are really critical to the work that we do. So using qualitative methods to help us generate hypotheses and models about how interventions work in practice or evidence-based practices work in practice that can be further tested with quantitative approaches is a key role that qualitative methods plays for implementation science as a field. And this is a little bit repetitive of my slide I just showed, but I think it bears underscoring that qualitative methods allows us to collect really rich, nuanced data. And that rich descriptive data, that kind of thick data I think I've heard it referred to, can provide a nuanced understanding of complex phenomena, offering really key insights into behaviors, interactions, and systems that, again, it can be hard sometimes to quantify or to fully glean from quantitative approaches to examining an implementation effort or context. So here's a screenshot of a paper which discusses qualitative methods in implementation research. It goes over the points we just discussed in terms of the value of qualitative methods to implementation science, but also has some practical advice about applying these methods to implementation projects. And I included a citation for this paper in a list of resources at the end of the slide deck. So you'll see that in just a little bit. This table is taken from that article that I just showed you a screenshot from. And I think it does a really nice job giving example research questions that might be pursued using qualitative methods and tying them to implementation outcomes. So in this table, the study that the questions relate to is a collaborative care model for women veterans seeking treatment for depression. And collaborative care is when you kind of locate mental health or behavioral health care within like a primary care context, or sometimes other contexts like obstetrics and gynecology. So just to run through like a couple of these questions, for feasibility, implementation outcome, the extent to which an innovation can practically be used in a given setting, an example kind of qualitative question that we might use to help us get information about the feasibility of this collaborative care intervention in our context is, how do we ensure that gender-tailored collaborative care model, again, it was targeting women veterans with depression, is feasible within different configurations of primary care. So I like this table because I think it can help serve as a model for like, okay, I think qualitative methods, would be a good thing for me to use in the context of this, implementation study, but it's helpful to see a model of what it looks like and what kinds of questions are like well suited to this approach. So having given some of that background and just explaining like why I'm talking about this topic to you all today, I'm going to dive more directly into our rapid content today. So a more specific way of describing the approach I'll be discussing today is as a framework guided approach, which stems from framework analysis. The defining feature of a framework analysis is that you produce a matrix where columns are codes or topics of interest, could be research questions, and rows are cases. Most often, a participant is a case, and the cell, so the cross of topic and case, is where data is summarized or reduced. So each cell is, what did this row's participant have to say about this column's topic? And I'm going to show some examples of this in just a few minutes with visuals to kind of, in case, we have some visual learners out there, so you can kind of get a sense of what this looks like. And really importantly, before I jump in, I want to note that I'm standing on the shoulders of giants here. I'm going to present on an approach to framework-guided, rapid qualitative analysis that we've used frequently in our projects within the Bridge program, but this is not an entirely new approach. We are building off of the work of others in this space, and I kind of tried to present some screenshots here of this Gale article, which is also included in the kind of resource list at the end of the slide deck. And this screenshot on the right is from a presentation given by Alison Hamilton, who has done a lot of work in this space, specifically rapid qualitative analysis. So, building off of others, but in our experience as the, a research program using this approach, we have kind of, I think, developed some ways of optimizing some of the pieces, or, at least it's been working well for us. So I will kind of, highlight those things as we go through. And just to note that the resource list at the end, like I would definitely suggest if you want to learn more about this, definitely check it out. Including one of the things that I will link is another like lecture on rapid qual given by Alison Hamilton. So good little kind of next step for further learning for those who are interested. Okay, So what is the value of a framework-guided rapid approach? The most obvious advantage is time, as you might guess, particularly if you're looking to turn around results quickly. So for example, if you want, the results of your qual so that you can inform the next steps of your study, and you kind of need to move forward with that relatively fast, this can be a good approach to take. That's often why we use an approach like this in implementation science, because time is really of the essence. We're in an active implementation effort. It's also valuable to use this approach because it's step-by-step and structured. It gives a very structured output, of summarized or condensed data. It doesn't require specialized software. So in Bridge, we've used just the Google Suite versions of Word and Excel, which can be really nice, I think, for kind of usability, feasibility. Also, this approach can be supported by individuals with limited or even potentially no experience with qualitative data analysis, but it's really important to stress that the effort should be led by someone experienced in qualitative methods who's overseeing the data condensation or summarization process. But even though I said that time is an advantage, I want to be clear that rapid is a relative term. Want to set some kind of realistic expectations around what we mean when we say rapid. Even when you're using an approach like this, qualitative analysis done well takes time. So projects that I've been involved in where we've been using this approach with Bridge recently, it still takes several months to go from interviews to finalized summaries of responses that are ready to be included in something like a results section of a manuscript. So when might this approach to analysis be a good fit? It's also really important to keep in mind that not every project that involves qual is going to be a good fit for a framework-guided approach. So I wanted to take a moment to describe some features of research projects or questions which lend themselves well to this approach versus research projects or questions which may not be, oh God, sorry, my water bottle's making noises, may not be as good of a fit for this analytic approach. So overarching point, framework-guided approaches don't accommodate heterogeneous data very effectively. Participant responses really need to be able to be categorized into these topics of interest relatively easily, which those become the columns of your matrix. So what do I mean by that in terms of like some kind of concrete features to keep an eye out for, like, oh, okay, this might make my project a good fit versus it may not. I'm going to go through a few of those right now. So the first is this approach can fit well when you have an applied research focus. So if your project is aiming to inform policy, practice, or intervention, this approach can structure data in a way that makes it easily communicatable to key informants or other decision makers. So you can apply what you're learning. Also, if you have predefined research questions, this kind of framework-guided approach can work well because it can allow for a focused exploration of the data based off of those kind of a priori topics or categories, which you've already, kind of pre-specified beforehand. If you have a clear kind of conceptual framework, so when your research is informed, very directly by an existing theory, model, or framework, as again is often the case with implementation science, this approach to analysis can allow you to structure your data around those predetermined categories in a really nice way. You still do leave some room for new themes to emerge, and I'll kind of show you what I mean by that or how we do that. So it's not totally pre-identified, but projects that do have more of that kind of predefined framework tend to be a better fit. When you have comparative studies, this approach can fit well. Maybe you're looking at comparison across different cases, so different participants. Maybe it's different sites, various perhaps demographic groups within a sample. The framework analytic method allows for organizing data in a systematic way that, kind of by these categories that can really facilitate this kind of cross comparison in a helpful way. This is an important one, I think, often for implementation studies. When you have multiple researchers involved, this sort of an approach to analysis can be really helpful because the structured nature of a framework analysis, kind of ending with that matrix, can ensure consistency in data handling and interpretation across different team members and can allow for, perhaps easier sharing of your data across team members who may be, geographically spread apart or disciplinarily or both. It can really, I think, be a good touch point for sharing that information. Also, if you have large amounts of data, this approach can be helpful in organizing and summarizing the information without losing too much depth from it. Okay, flip side, when is this approach not as good of a fit? If your work is more exploratory, like highly exploratory, and aims to generate new theories or concepts, so kind of taking more of like a grounded theory or phenomenological approach, it's kind of more open-ended. Framework analysis might be a bit too structured or inductive if you're looking for this framework might be too structured for a more inductive bottom-up exploration of the data. It may just feel kind of like a mismatch. Similarly, when you want themes or categories to emerge almost like entirely from the data, like without much of a kind of predefined framework, other approaches might be more suitable. As you'll see, and as I've kind of telegraphed, there is some room to capture emergent data that comes up, emergent topics, but your project really, if you're using this approach, is kind of set up to collect data in a more pre-specified categorical way. So if you want those categories to kind of come from the data, this is probably not the best match. If your research is seeking to have kind of a more fluid interpretive approach, like almost like a narrative analysis approach, framework analysis again may kind of feel a little bit too rigid. And if you have kind of deeply theoretical, philosophical, research questions or focuses, or you're kind of concerned with like abstract concepts, like kind of like existential inquiry, the kind of systematic coding and categorizing that the framework analysis is set up to do might feel kind of constraining on the interpretation. Okay, so now I'm going to walk you through kind of the steps of this process. And I want to note, as I mentioned before, that I'm standing on the shoulders of giants and presenting the steps that the Bridge team has taken, but we did not invent these steps. There are like little pieces that we've added that I think have like facilitated the process and kind of enhanced the process, but we did not create this process. All right, and so the kind of skeleton of the steps is based upon what Allison Hamilton has presented previously. Okay, so overview of the 5 steps are 1, and I'm going to go through each in more depth, but 1, make a summary template for each interview or focus group, depending on what your kind of data collection unit is. Take the summary templates for a test drive, so making sure that they're working well, and I'm going to talk more about how you index that in just a minute. Code using the summary templates, transfer the summaries into that matrix I was talking about, and then create topic summaries for each matrix column. So I'm going to go through each in turn. And this is where Harry Potter comes in. So to walk you through these steps and to hopefully make it a little more engaging, perhaps, I'm going to use kind of a toy example where we will apply these steps of rapid kind of framework guided qualitative analysis. So for those who are unfamiliar with the Harry Potter books, house elves are creatures that essentially are servants performing housework and other chores for the magical folk. And during the fourth Harry Potter book, Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, the notion of house elf liberation begins to be discussed. So we as a research team are tasked with analyzing a document, page from the novel, to understand house elf opinions about house elf liberation. A couple of notes just for orientation. Winky and Dobby are house elves. Dobby used to work for Harry, who is the protagonist of the series, but now works for Hogwarts, which is the wizarding school that Harry and his friends Ron and Hermione attend. And the scene we are going to read/analyze finds Harry and Hermione at Hogwarts talking to these two house elves, Dobby and Winky. So this is the document we're going to be analyzing. I think for sake of time, I probably won't read the whole thing. But essentially, we've been given this page from the novel and we need to summarize, okay, how do house elves feel about house elf liberation? So step one, we make our summary template. For this step, you'll essentially transform your interview guide or your research questions into a table like this, where the first column is the question asked or the domain of focus that you're interested in. The second column is the key points that are brought up in whatever document you're analyzing, whether that's an interview. And this is where the person condensing the data, aka summarizing what the participant said about that topic, puts their summary. We also have an exemplar quotes column that we typically use, which helps to capture particularly poignant quotes. One thing you can't see in this screenshot that is important to include is that we will also put in other row kind of underneath our pre-specified domains of interest to capture information brought up that does not fit into the other domain. So that's again where we have that room for things to emerge. To be clear, there is one of these summary templates that is made per case, and a case is usually an interview. So each interview transcript would be reviewed and have a summary template filled out for it. In our toy example, we're analyzing one document, but we would have a different case for Dobby's opinions on house elf liberation, Winky's opinions on house elf liberation. And their names can be noted at the top, or their participant ID number, so you know which one you're tying which interview to which summary. So then step two, so we've made our summary template, we've drafted it, but we want to take it for a test drive in which all the team members on your kind of coding or your data condensation team basically use the summary template on a small subset of interviews, and everyone on the team uses the same subset. And you want to assess two main aspects when you do that test drive. The first is the template itself and, whether you want to do any changing or refining of it. But you're also assessing the coding of the various team members, making sure that there is consistency in the way that folks are using the template, the way they're summarizing. So in terms of assessing the template, some things we might be thinking about are the domains that we're looking for easily findable in the data? Is there anything we're missing or we should label differently in the summary template? How easy is it to use? The benchmark that we tend to use and that I've been kind of given before is it should take about an hour to complete a summary template for an interview. If it's much longer than that, you probably want to revisit the template and see if there's something that's not working. It's something that you could change that might help make it a little more user-friendly. And in terms of assessing the coding of team members, you can look at the volume of information that each of the team members are including per domain. You want to make sure folks are minimizing use of direct quotes in their summary. And also that they're making what I kind of call meta notes. So meta notes could be things like information about the absence of content. So they might put in brackets, question not asked, or question asked but not answered, or other comments about the interview, like this interview has a lot of information about this topic. And the qualitative lead, so person who has expertise in qualitative analysis, will be the one kind of leading that analysis of the test drive and the point person for assessing these things. So how well is the template working, and how consistent is the coding among the team members? And some main points to think about when assessing the summaries that folks on your team are making is that you want them to be thorough. So you want to make sure the major points are captured. You want them to be readable, so anyone reading the summary should get a sense for what was said by the participant. And you want them to be useful, so providing pointers for like what's in the transcript, so that people really, kind of get that meta sense too of all the information that's captured. Okay, so a few notes on summarizing. Or condensing while filling out the summary template, which that basically means, for this topic of interest, how self-liberation, we're summarizing down what Dobby said about that. So that's that condensing coding process when we're filling out a summary template. With data reduction, it is still part of an analysis. It's an analytic decision what information you pull out and what story you tell. Ideally, data reduction kind of sharpens, focuses, and sorts the data in a way that allows for conclusions to be drawn. That said, we want it to be a minimally interpretable process. So we want summaries to convey what was said, but not conjecture about more than what was strictly said. This may seem obvious, but it can be easy, especially if you're going through a number of interviews in a row. It can be easy sometimes to slip into over-interpreting without even really realizing this. So we just need to be, assessing this in our coding and keeping ourselves honest. And it can also be really helpful to do things like have, double coding. So multiple people coding the same thing, just to kind of help keep us honest with that. Okay. Another note is to be sure to not strip the data from the context in which it occurred. So one thing that our team has begun doing is that we have had coders highlight the text in the transcript that they are coding in a certain domain, so AKA row of summary template, like opinions on how self-liberation, and put a comment of which domain they are coding that information under. So this is helpful for tying our data condensation back to the data itself. Data condensation or data reduction, I'm using those interchangeably. So we can see our quote highlighted and labeled with domain 1, which is opinions about liberation. So, just to kind of give you an example of the data itself. So domain 1, the highlighted text, I know it might be a little bit small here, on this top is that Professor Dumbledore offered Dobby 10 galleons a week and weekends off, said Dobby, suddenly giving a little shiver as though the prospect of so much leisure and riches were frightening. But Dobby beat him down, miss. Dobby likes freedom, miss, but he isn't wanting too much, miss. He likes the work better. So that for Dobby's row, for the domain of his opinions on liberation, this is the chunk of text that we are reducing down. And then I've highlighted here Winkies. So another way to capture context that is important for interpretation is, again, to include some of those what I've called meta comments. So if an interviewer probes for something, you might want to put that in your cell, interviewer probed for opinions about pay or something like that, just to make sure that if there is kind of important context, that in order for the kind of data summary to be thorough, needs to be captured. You want to be putting those meta comments in so that we're considering that when we're writing up our results for how folks were, what their opinions and perspectives were around these topics. It helps the reader to kind of understand the nuances of what was captured in the transcript. So in our toy example, we might mention right before Winky's response that Hermione asked this question of, how much is Dumbledore paying you, Winky? Hermione asked kindly. And we also might want to make a comment because Winky, essentially, without reading it directly, she starts crying, Winky the house elf. So we might want to make a comment about Winky's emotional response in this quote, kind of like what was observed. Okay, So once consistency has been established and the summary template is finalized, you can divide up the remaining interviews among the team members and have them code the interviews using the summary template. As a reminder, in our toy example, our cases are from the same document, but each would get their own summary. So Dobby gets one, Winky gets one. And you can see how I've coded Dobby and Winky's opinions of liberation. So for Dobby, he likes to be free, but still enjoys working. He did express some discomfort around benefits like pay and time off, and requested less of these than initially offered. For Winky, feels ashamed of her freedom. That's how I summarized that text. Kind of thinking methodologically and process-wise, we as a bridge team have taken the approach, or I have personally in my recent uses of this process, I've taken the approach of reviewing all summary templates and transcripts and providing feedback before finalizing. So I might have, one or two coders who are doing, filling out the summary templates for each interview, and I will review their template and I will review the transcript itself, just as kind of like a kind of double coding essentially. It can be really helpful too to kind of do that in batches and provide some feedback, especially for folks for coders rather, who are more qualitative methods inexperienced, who just haven't had the experience before, but also having, those two sets of eyes and two minds looking and summarizing also lends some additional credibility to the summarization process. So you can kind of build in training in the process if you kind of assign these in batches. So you give a batch to the coder, you review it, you give feedback, you give another batch, you give feedback, and over the course of the batches, there tends to be less and less need for feedback. It's also important to note, especially if your summary template follows very directly from your interview guide. So basically each row in your summary template is a question from your guide. You want to summarize content in the row where it is most applicable. This may not always be the row of the question that participants were responding to. So what I mean by that is, like, for example, if, our expert for Dobby was asked, let's say Dobby was asked, what did he think about liberation? And instead of responding to that, he discussed specific thoughts about how much house elves should be paid. We would want to code or summarize rather that info under thoughts on house elf pay, if that was like our domain 2, for example. And you can make a comment. So we'll usually do one of those meta comments in brackets saying, provided this response to a question about liberation, just to be kind of clear about, again, some of that additional context. And you might put for like the liberation question, like asked but not answered. So then in step 4, we actually make our matrix. And again, as I've said, essentially each row is a participant or subject. Each column is a domain or kind of a domain of interest or question from your interview guide. You'll notice that something our team has started doing is including space for quotes in the matrix. This can be really helpful as you are kind of writing up your results because you're already highlighting along in the process some quotes that are of particular interest. And then once you have your data in this matrix, you are enabled with, several actions that you can take from here. You can kind of quickly peruse the content for a given domain and get a sense of variation or lack thereof. You can also assess gaps in information. So this can be helpful to analyze your data collection process. Were there certain questions that weren't getting asked consistently? Were there questions that didn't seem to work well, like people were answering essentially a different question? And additionally, through being able to peruse content to get a sense of if there is repetition of points or gaps in information, this can also inform your sense of data saturation, which can help you to determine whether you're ready to cease collecting data. So do we feel like, with each row, people are kind of bringing up the same things, maybe we're reaching saturation, or do we feel like, no, everyone's bringing up kind of different things and we really need to keep sampling and exploring this because new stuff's coming up. Then in step 5, you create topic summaries for each domain or matrix column. And you can see a screenshot here of the matrix summary worksheet that we've used on our team that has instructions for how to create each summary. I actually got consultation about this step during my time in the Qualitative Science and Methods training program here at Brown. Shout out to those folks, would definitely recommend participation in that. And I got some consultation around this because in what I had kind of read or viewed previously about this framework guided approach, there wasn't as much guidance about how you go from the matrix to like your results. So it was really helpful to get some consultation around that. But essentially you go down each column, participant by participant, and you put the point made and the ID number of who said it. And then you go to person 2 and you summarize the points they made, making sure to attribute them to the correct ID number and parentheticals. And if folks are making the same point, you can just add their ID number, kind of append their ID number. Or if, participant 2 is expanding on something that participant 1 said, you can have participant 1's point, their ID number, and then the expansion by participant 2, their ID number, kind of all in the same line. And then these summaries can become your results section of your presentation or manuscript or whatever deliverable you're working towards. And you will need to kind of iteratively reorganize your points as you go, and you're incorporating more participants' data. And then we put our summaries in a table like this. And these summaries become, again, your results section. So opinions about liberation, Winky said, Winky feels shame. Some other house elves expressed discomfort around benefits and pay time off, though they liked being free. And then we also always leave space for quotes. So I put Dobby's quote in there. Okay. So we could have a whole separate discussion, and I know I'm running a little bit short on time, on incorporating implementation science theories, models, and frameworks into our qualitative methods. But I wanted to take just a minute to discuss this and show you how it might be done with this kind of framework guided approach. So as you might recall, typically your matrix will closely follow your interview guide, and often in implementation science, your questions in your guide will be informed by theories, models, and frameworks. So in this study that I'm including a screenshot from, you can see we were asking about barriers and facilitators, though you can only see facilitators here, and to engaging in an intervention. And we had our columns or domains of interest be elements from the CFR, or the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research. So we were kind of pulling our condensed data or our summaries and organizing it into columns by the CFR. And then you could, then make a topic summary or topic summary down the column of all the facilitators related to the individual level construct from CFR. It's not the only way to incorporate theories, models, and frameworks, though. Another project we're currently working on had matrix columns or domains that were kind of a one-to-one correspondence with interview questions, and they weren't directly tied to a theory, model, and framework. And this was a study about an intervention, a study about trying to get information from key informants, from the people we interviewed, about how to deliver an intervention, ideally within the current healthcare context. And so what we did, the framework method for, was essentially summarizing down how people responded to questions like, what would be the ideal delivery system within this healthcare context? What are your opinions about delivering it in a group medical visit in this context? But the PI of that project was really interested in the triple aim framework, which is a healthcare optimization framework. So we're currently kind of going back and looking at our our matrix summaries and highlighting, essentially, coding, and kind of another round of coding different triple aim framework constructs that are coming up in the way people responded to these questions. So that's another way it might look. So as I promised, here are some additional resources that you should definitely check out if you want to learn more about this approach. The first one is, or sorry, the second one here is another video that the Allison Hamilton lecture that I mentioned. And now we have some time for questions. So I will welcome Alethea back.
Thanks, Ari. So as we wait for some questions to come into the chat, I just want to thank you again for this super clear and well-structured presentation that I think was super helpful to really understand the rapid qual methods, and your examples were really great and engaging. So thank you again. And I guess I have one question to start us off. You did mention kind of how frameworks can be used to guide the interview questions or the coding process. And I guess I was wondering to take one step back and maybe consider, maybe it would be useful to our audience, pick your brain about how to choose a framework or what would go into choosing a specific theory model or framework, because we know there are many of them out there. And then how to go about that and why, and then how that informs sort of your interview guide as well.
It's a really good question. And as you well know, Alethea, comes up a lot in our consultations. So I think, as is probably often the case, certainly in implementation science, there's not one right answer. But one tool that I think has been really helpful sometimes as a place to start is, and I don't know if I'm going to know the link off the top of my head, but there is like a implementation dissemination, basically theory model framework directory that's searchable. And what I like about that is that you can search by like different constructs of interest. So like if you are interested in certain like ecological levels, like the policy level or kind of the outer setting level, you can filter your responses by constructs that are most relevant. And that can be sometimes a good place to start, just making sure that you are selecting a theory model and framework that fits well for the questions that you're asking. I also think there's something to be said, and this is something we discuss in our Bridge bootcamp, but there's definitely like a subset that are often used, like the RI-AIM framework is often used for evaluations, CFER is often used as a determinant framework, and I think there can be a lot, when in doubt, to be said for trying on for size, one of the commonly used ones, because there's they often have like their own websites with tools you can use, and there are a lot of like papers to reference. So that's another, I think, place to start would be looking at one of those kind of classic hits, I guess, of theories, models, and frameworks, and seeing if it fits as a tool or way of providing structure to the data you want to collect in your specific study.
Thanks. That's really helpful. And it's a great point. There are some useful tools online and websites that can help provide some information or guide people to consider specific theories, models, and frameworks. And I guess also like what stage the implementation process is at, whether the focus is on evaluating implementation outcomes or determinants or maybe the process of implementation. So I think those are some great suggestions. Thank you. We also have a question, or a couple of questions coming up in the chat. One question from Dr. Hannah Frank is, I'm curious if you can provide some suggestions for how to structure interview guides so that the resulting data are well suited for rapid qual analysis.
Yeah, that's it's a good question. So I think, and this isn't the only way to do like a framework guided approach, but sometimes the approach you do want to take is where essentially like domains of interest are like one-to-one mapped with your interview guide questions. So like say, to mention the project that I briefly mentioned before, if your interview question 1 is, what do you think is the ideal way to deliver this intervention in the current healthcare context? That's question 1. And then, you're going to use this as your domain 1. If you're going to do a one-to-one correspondence like that, I think you want to keep in mind what I was saying earlier about basically having kind of a clear sense for what exactly you're kind of looking for within that domain or within that question, and like being kind of specific. So like we are looking for delivery system recommendations. So whether it's virtual or in person, whether it's group or individual, just so that it's really clear for your coders what information needs to be summarized and put in that column. If you're finding, and like, I guess this is not only a question for setting up your interview guide, but also thinking like more broadly about what analytic approach would fit the best. If you have questions that don't lend themselves well to kind of like these more pre-specified domains or columns, maybe that means that this approach doesn't fit very well. Maybe you want to know like what is the firsthand experience of going through a certain type of treatment or something kind of like more exploratory. So it could be, I guess, just to say, it could be if you're finding that like, it doesn't really seem like my research questions are fitting very well into this format, that may mean there's nothing wrong with your research questions, just that this approach may not be the best fit for you. So anyway, that might have been a little bit of a tangent, but it's a good question and it's a good point. And certainly helpful if you do want to use this approach and you feel pretty committed to this approach, to be thinking about like, as I'm writing these questions, what is my summary template going to look like? What is my matrix going to look like? Just to kind of like ease that process for you and your coders from the beginning. So you're setting yourself up so that's clear how it's supposed to be used.
Well, that's great feedback. And I think also a good reminder that starting from the research questions is probably the most important step, regardless of what methodology you're going to use for analyzing the data. That's really the place to start. So I think that was a great point to add in there. And another question that has come up: with this methodology, do you calculate any measures of reliability between coders? Which I think that's another great point for clarification. And follow up, if there are any common concerns that come up when publishing this work in journals that publish maybe more traditional qualitative work.
Yeah, really good question. So with the first one, we have not, just in my experience of using this method, we have not done formal calculations, like coefficient calculations of reliability between coders. We do build in the kind of the training process and the coding process, that double coding piece, and having the test drive all together at the beginning of the summary so that there is kind of more credibility to this process. And as I've mentioned, the projects that I've been like the qualitative lead on, I have basically done like a double code on every interview. You could take an approach where you, if you feel like consistency has been established, and not necessarily using like a statistical marker of that, but just by your kind of assessment, which I guess might feel like a little bit squishy to some folks who are more accustomed to taking a quantitative approach to that. But you could, if you feel like consistency has been established, just divide up the remaining ones among the coders, and you don't necessarily have to double code everything. With the papers that I've submitted, kind of using that double coding or like review and discuss approach, I haven't run into any problems like from reviewers. And this kind of gets into the second question about journals that publish more traditional qualitative work. And this might just be like my personal experience, I don't know that I have personally submitted before to a journal that has like qualitative methods in the title. I typically have been submitting these papers to either implementation science focused journals or journals that are kind of content area focused. So like the intervention study I was talking about was like a mindfulness-based stress reduction intervention. So have been submitting to mindfulness journals. But there has not been any issue that I've encountered personally or that I've heard of from colleagues who have used this approach with using the more rapid approach. I think you just want to make sure if you're going to take this rapid approach, this framework guided approach, that you are, doing it in accordance with like how the Gale article describes the process, which I included in the reference list, or how, Alison Hamilton in her description of the process describes it, and always being sure that you're being thoughtful of like key qualitative concepts, like how are you thinking about saturation? What thought went into your sample size decisions? Those kinds of things. So like the core Q, for example, or other checklists, like reporting checklists for qualitative methods, no matter which approach you take, would be important to be citing and including the details that are specified there when you are writing up these results, even though they're like this rapid framework approach, they're not excluded from those same sort of expectations. And I mean, my gut from not having experienced it firsthand is that if you did those things, you followed the method correctly and you were thoughtful and transparent about these reporting, like core Q reporting requirements or recommendations, I think you would probably be fine. But I guess it is kind of an empirical question that I don't personally have an answer to, but can say anecdotally, I haven't had a problem.
Yeah, that's been my experience too, in trying to submit or publish papers that include this method, just for some additional feedback for our audience. And, I think the key is exactly what you said. It's about making sure you're referencing the methodology and how it's been used before and clearly describing the steps, because it is actually quite structured. So, as you pointed out through your talk. So I think that's a great note to conclude on. Thanks for the questions in the chat, and thank you everyone for attending this talk and for all of those who attended some of our other talks this fall. This is our last talk in the fall 2024 seminar series on implementation science. And so we hope many of you will join us next year and look out for those emails or other announcements for our next speaker lineup in the fall of 2025. Okay, thank you, everyone.